Florida has a highway that goes from its southern tip all the way to the middle of the ocean, for about 120 miles. This is Florida's highway to nowhere, perhaps better known as the Overseas Highway. But why build a highway that doesn't seem to connect to anything important? Well, to start, we need to first talk a bit about the Florida Keys. Imagine a place where the land seems to melt into the sea, where emerald and sapphire waters stretch as far as the eye can see, dotted with tiny islands. This isn't some far-flung tropical paradise from a travel brochure. It's the unique geography of the Florida Keys, a remarkable archipelago that forms the southern tip of Florida. And to fully understand why a highway to nowhere was built here, we first need to grasp the extraordinary geography upon which it was built. First, the Florida Keys are a crescent-shaped chain of islands stretching southwest from the southeastern tip of the Florida Peninsula, curving towards Key West, and then gently arcing westward to the uninhabited dry Tortugas. This remarkable formation is just 120 miles long, making it a sliver of land that separates the vast Atlantic Ocean to the east from the calmer, shallower waters of the Gulf of Mexico to the west. And unlike typical islands formed by volcanic activity or continental separation, the Florida Keys are actually ancient coral reefs that have been exposed and hardened over millennia. Think of it like this. Eons ago, these areas were vibrant underwater coral ecosystems. As sea levels fluctuated and geologic processes unfolded, these reefs gradually rose above the surface, forming the limestone foundation of the islands we see today. This geological history explains their generally low elevation and porous nature. The islands themselves vary greatly in size and character. Some, like Kurgo, are relatively large with enough land for towns and large tracts of homes. Others are tiny slivers just wide enough for a few buildings or even simply a strand of mangroves. But what unites them is the omnipresent water surrounding them. The shallow, clear waters of the Keys are a defining feature. To the west, the Florida Bay is a vast, shallow expanse, often just a few feet deep, teeming with unique marine life adapted to its brackish conditions. To the east, the deeper waters of the Atlantic give way to the Florida Reef Tract, the fifth largest barrier reef system in the world. The Florida Keys are a geographic marvel, but for centuries, this island chain remained largely isolated. But at some point, someone got the idea in their head to build a highway all the way through it, which begins with an ambitious yet ultimately ill-fated dream of the Overseas Railroad. Before the grand visions of causeways and bridges, the Florida Keys were a patchwork of independent settlements. Key West, at the very end of the chain, was the undisputed jewel of the region and a bustling port city by the 1800s, rich from salvaging shipwrecks, cigar manufacturing, and sponge diving. And because it was located in the Caribbean, it was a true melting pot with strong ties to Cuba and the other islands, often feeling more like a foreign land than part of the United States mainland. Now, all that said, the Keys were far more remote. Many were only accessible by boat, home to fishermen, farmers, especially of key limes and pineapples, and a scattering of sponges. Life on these islands was tough and reliant on the unpredictability of the ocean. And of course, hurricanes were a constant, terrifying threat capable of wiping out entire communities. Travel between islands was an arduous undertaking dictated by tides, weather, and the limited availability of small vessels. At this point in time, the idea of a continuous overland journey from the mainland to Key West was an impossible fantasy. This isolation began to change with the arrival of one man, Henry Flagler, a co-founder of Standard Oil. Flagler was a titan of industry who had already transformed Florida's East Coast, with his Florida East Coast Railway and a string of luxury hotels. But his grandest ambition was to extend his railway all the way to Key West, mostly because Key West's deep-water port offered the perfect gateway for trade with Cuba, and the construction of the Panama Canal, providing a direct link from the U.S. to burgeoning international commerce. So, beginning in 1905, Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway embarked on what many called Flagler's Folly, also known as the Overseas Railroad. Engineers and thousands of laborers began building bridges over miles of open ocean, driving pilings into soft seabed, all the while battling hurricanes, mosquitoes, and the intense tropical heat. Materials had to be shipped in. Entire work camps were established on remote keys. At one point, nearly 4,000 people worked on the Overseas Railroad, and it cost $50 million, which would be $1.8 billion today. For nearly 8 years, though, the work pushed forward. Miles of concrete viaducts, steel bridges, and causeways slowly stitched the islands together. Finally, on January 22, 1912, Henry Flagler himself rode the first train into Key West. Greeted by crowds, the Overseas Railroad was a staggering achievement. Widely hailed at the time as the eighth wonder of the world, it offered a continuous, smooth journey from the mainland to Key West, forever altering the Keys. Unfortunately, the railroad's reign was tragically cut short on Labor Day in 1935, one of the most powerful hurricanes in U.S. history. A Category 5 monster slammed directly into the upper Keys. The storm surge was catastrophic, wiping out entire sections of the railroad, including tracks. bridges, and equipment. Hundreds of lives were lost, including many World War I veterans working on a government relief project. The damage was so extensive and the financial toll so great that the Florida East Coast Railway, already struggling from the Great Depression, could not afford to rebuild. The eighth wonder of the world was abandoned. Its concrete piers and steel rails left as skeletal reminders of Flagler's grand dream. The destruction of the overseas railroad left the Keys once again disconnected, though not entirely isolated thanks to remaining boat access. Yet, the vision of a continuous link persisted. The railroad's demise paved the way for a new idea, one that would transform its ruins into a different kind of marvel: the overseas highway. With the overseas railroad in ruins, the Florida Keys were once again largely cut off from the mainland, leaving many to wonder, why would Florida, after such a monumental and costly failure, embark on building another major thoroughfare to what still seemed to many like the middle of nowhere? After all, at this point, Miami was already the major port of the region. In Key West, the largest settlement on the Keys, home to just a little over 25,000 people by 1950. That's a lot of effort for not a lot of people. The immediate aftermath of the 1935 hurricane left the Keys in a precarious state. Key West, once a bustling port thanks to the railroad, faced economic collapse. Without the direct rail link, the flow of goods, tourists, and fresh produce was severely hampered. The islands, already vulnerable due to their low-lying nature, now faced the added burden of extreme isolation, making recovery and future growth seem impossible. There was a desperate need to reconnect to the mainland. Enter the opportunity presented by Flagler's abandoned railway. While the hurricane had destroyed much of the tracks and many wooden trestles, critically, a significant portion of the massive concrete viaducts built to withstand hurricanes remained remarkably intact. These colossal structures offered an incredible foundation for something new. As such, the state of Florida, through its roads department, saw the potential during an age when the United States was investing massively in building its way out of the Great Depression. Converting the existing railroad foundations into a highway presented a far more economically viable solution than rebuilding a railway, which was seen as a dated form of transportation technology. You see, by the 1930s, the automobile was rapidly becoming the dominant mode of personal and commercial transportation in America. A highway, rather than a railroad, aligned perfectly with this evolving trend, and the federal government of the United States at the time was practically handing out billions of dollars to states to build things everywhere. But building a highway to nowhere would still require some justification, beyond wanting to reconnect Key West to the mainland. And the military provided a really good one. At the time, the Keys held strategic military importance, especially with growing global tensions leading up to World War II. A reliable land link to Key West would facilitate troop and supply movements to naval bases located along the Keys. And so, beginning in the early 1930s, construction on the overseas highway began. Remaining railroad tracks were removed, and the wide flat road was paved. Where bridges had been destroyed, new, wider structures were built, often alongside or incorporating the original piers. The famed 7mm bridge, a marvel in its own right, was a testament to this transformation. Initially repurposing segments of the old railroad bridge for vehicular traffic. Opened fully to traffic in 1938, the overseas highway was more than just a road. It was a symbol for the state of Florida. It transformed the isolated Middle Keys into accessible communities and cemented Key West's status as an American destination. But what was once considered a remote and challenging environment connected by a miraculous but fragile railroad was now easily reachable by anyone with a vehicle. Today, the overseas highway is still the primary means of connecting Key West and the disparate community of the Florida Keys to the mainland. And every day, about 30,000 people will travel along the roadway, which is impressive given that the highway literally ends in the middle of the ocean. So, Florida's highway isn't a highway to nowhere. It just looks like it is. That said, though, it's not a highway to much. And if it were a project proposed today, I doubt it would ever be built. I hope you enjoyed learning all about the overseas highway. If you did, check out this video all about Point Roberts, the United States. Weird kind of Canadian peninsula. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Hey, there's no sponsor for today's video, but I do want to take a moment to say go subscribe to my Substack newsletter. It's 100% free and you'll get extra geography articles from me every week. So, what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code to check it out.